Quite naturally, my next question was, where and how did all of this start? What was Thor's beginning? Who was the originator of this tremendously diversified operation that today serves so many fields with so many products? I learned these answers from still another market that Thor has served since the company's founding in 1893, the railroads. Trace the beginning of many companies. Most of them originate with the first mechanical transportation era that propelled this nation along its initial stride to progress on the iron rails and in the wood-burning engine of the first railroad. The tall, stacked locomotives and the straw seat coaches that carried the first passengers across the plains were being built the hard way, the only way our pioneers knew. As more and more golden spikes were driven to connect the East with the West, demands for more moving equipment grew. Production had to be accelerated. Faster methods for building engines and coaches had to be found. Forward-looking suppliers to the industry had their ideas. Their imaginations were busy. They saw the market for a product that could speed the production of America's first mechanical transportation. One such pioneer was John D. Hurley, the first president of what is today the Thor Power Tool Company. John and his brother, Edward N. Hurley, sold supplies and equipment to railroad shops in the Middle West. They had watched machinists turning cumbersome ratchet drills to pierce holes in iron and steel. They dreamed of the day when drilling could be mechanized, just as the railroads had mechanized the prairie schooner. That day came unexpectedly, dramatically. It was a day in the early 1890s. Ed Hurley was walking down a Chicago street on his way to the office when a friend called to him from the porch of his home. This man was a railroad machinist. He had an invention in his basement that he wanted to show to Hurley. Well, they went down to the basement, and there was the crude model of the Hurley brothers' dream come true. The inventor had fabricated a mechanical piston-driven drill that operated on compressed air. Ed Hurley didn't walk the rest of the way to work that morning. He hurried to the closest streetcar. His plan was set when he leaped to the street in the Chicago Loop. He had the product. Now he needed capital to perfect it, to manufacture it, to market it. To raise money, he needed partners. He found them. And later, when the air drill had been perfected and made ready for production, they joined with him to launch what was the beginning of the Thor Empire. 4 men created that beginning. They were John and Ed Hurley, John Hopkins, who was later to become mayor of Chicago, and Roger Sullivan, another famous Chicago political figure. It was their plan to organize a sales company in Chicago to sell the air drill to the railroads. But first they needed a factory and people to make the drills. 40 miles west of Chicago, in the town of Aurora, bicycle parts were being manufactured in a small machine shop located in the corner of a corset factory. 2 enterprising young men rented the space and operated the shop. They were Axel Levedal and Charles Erickson. Levedal, the mechanic, and Erickson, the office manager, had previously operated a machine shop in Chicago. But, and believe it or not, the trend of moving to the suburbs started way back there in the 90s. They wanted to get away from the big city turmoil. Simon Florsheim, who owned the corset factory, was their first landlord and their first customer. They repaired the machines and equipment used in the corset factory and then got into bicycle parts production for other manufacturers. They also machined small parts for another tool factory in Aurora, and it was this connection that brought the Hurley brothers to them. When the Aurora men saw the piston air drill, their imaginations raced as fast as the Hurleys. Immediately, the sales and management team of the Hurley brothers and Hopkins and Sullivan was joined by the production force of Levedal and Erickson. A business firm was incorporated in 1893 to identify the operation as the Aurora Automatic Machinery Company. And soon the first production models of the new Thor piston air drill came off the small assembly line at Aurora. Now it was John Hurley's responsibility to sell them, and with this challenge came his first obstacle. The railroad machinists hesitated to even try this powerful machine. It was so new, so radical compared with slow hand tools, that it looked dangerous to them. But John Hurley was not to be stopped. He selected a few young machinists and trained them. When they could run the tools efficiently, he took them with him all over the country as demonstrators. Then the door opened. The railroads had their answer to at least one phase of faster production. Now Hurley needed sales help in the field, and he had another big idea. The world's greatest salesman in that fabulous era of the 90s was a figure as colorful as the period itself, Diamond Jim Brady. His fantastic sales career had rocketed to nationwide prominence in one field, the railroad supply business. Diamond Jim knew every railroad officer and buyer, and thousands of men in the shops in every corner of the nation. His reputation brought railroad men to him. He was John Hurley's big sales idea. If the new Thor air drill was to be sold to every railroad, only one man could do it best, Diamond Jim. And when Hurley showed the drill to him, Brady was quick to join. He remained in New York to set the sales plan into motion. Hurley kept pace from the Chicago sales headquarters, and Levedall and Erickson were busy at the Aurora factory. The combination sent sales soaring beyond the plant's capacity. More property was secured, new buildings went up, more machinists were hired, and a great power tool industry was underway. The sales operation at Chicago was incorporated as Independent Pneumatic Tool Company, and Diamond Jim was its first president. In the meantime, Aurora Automatic Machinery Company was also experimenting in other fields to keep its machines busy. More and more orders were secured for producing bicycle parts. And then Axel Levedall started making parts for Indian motorcycles. This led to the idea of the company building its own motorcycle. The first model was a success, and soon the famous Thor name appeared on a single-engine motorcycle. The Thor V engine followed, and later Thor marketed the first sidecar for motorcycles. During this period, when Thor motorcycles were almost matching John Hurley's air tool production at Aurora, engineers even built an experimental automobile. Yes, and an experimental cotton picker. Neither was perfected, however, because Diamond Jim and Hurley were selling more tools every day. They needed more new tools, more production. To this busy scene came another key pioneer in Thor history, R.A. Norling, an engineer, and more importantly, a great engineer with another big idea that was to set the ambitious plans for more Thor air tools into high gear. Norling had a new style valve for air drills that was to take the railroad industry by storm. It brought amazing new efficiency to the Thor piston drill, and it was to become the heart of an entirely new concept in air tools that replaced the heavy piston machines. Norling became chief designer of Thor, and from the tables of his draftsmen came the new Thor tools to build a volume that crowded motorcycles out of the busy Aurora plant. Thor's greatest future loomed in the power tools it was pioneering for budding industries. In 1918, the Thor motorcycle faded from existence. The Aurora Automatic Machinery Company was dissolved, and the firm became Independent Pneumatic Tool Company. New idea followed new idea. New tools, new people joined an enterprise that was capturing new markets for Thor Power Tools, with the advent of each new era in American history. The automobile, the airplane, new roads, appliances, and many, many more of the fields we mentioned earlier. John Hurley was busy building more tool production in Aurora and organizing a nationwide sales organization. His heritage was to be taken up and expanded by another brother, Neil C. Hurley, who left the presidency of a major appliance company to help direct the Thor operation. And with him came a second generation in the pioneer family, Neil C. Hurley, Jr., who is today president of the company and who at the start of his career brought distributors into the picture to create a sales volume unheard of in the days when his uncles rode streetcars to make their sales calls and when Diamond Jim Brady was the sales champion. The Aurora factory was the pyramid to a 5-story manufacturing plant covering a city block. More than 1,000 men and women comprised its peak production force, and new tools kept coming. One day in the early 1920s, a salesman and former machinist brought a tool to the plant which he had been experimenting with at home. It was a drill, but it had an unusual attachment on it. He called the factory manager over to the testing room.
Look here, Mr. Hammerly. I think I've got something. A power screwdriver.
Well, the boss wasn't impressed. He knew the demand for drills and hammers and grinders, but screwdrivers? No, he thought anyone with experience could drive screws by hand many times faster than with a power tool. The salesman knew different. He had been in plants where products were assembled with many screws. He watched the slow hand operation and the fatigue on the operators who were trying to keep up with faster schedules. he invented a simple clutch device that held a metal screwdriver bit, and that fit on the spindle of a Thor Power drill. And he convinced that factory manager he drove screws 6 times faster that day than the best assembler in the factory. That was the first power screwdriver invented by Thor. The salesman was G.H. Doc Dussel, who in 1959 marked his 50th year with Thor, and who serves the company's far-flung sales organization as sales engineer. The power screwdriver that he developed was the forerunner of perhaps the greatest power tools ever produced, the tools that make possible modern mass production. Let's listen to Doc Dussel today and hear his story of Thor design leadership.
I grew up with this company. Back in the old days, I even helped make the Thor motorcycle. I even raced them in events around the country. It would take me hours to tell you all about the tools that were introduced to different markets by Thor. I, of course, remember the screwdriver best. That put us in the automobile, appliance, and furniture industries, just like the air drill got us started in the railroad shops. But that story can be repeated many times in our other divisions. We captured new markets because in most cases, we were the first with the tools they needed. This still goes on today. New Thor tools are coming out of our various factories and divisions 10 times faster than we ever dreamed was possible. We produce today more than 1,500 types of tools. Just imagine. And what is ahead for the future is fantastic.
This inventor of the first power screwdriver is so right. Thor today is a giant by comparison with the tiny machine shop that was the beginning in 1893. Incidentally, you have heard me use 3 names to identify the company. First, Aurora Automatic Machinery Company, then Independent Pneumatic Tool Company. The Thor name itself achieved such universal acceptance that finally, in 1953, the name was properly changed to Thor Power Tool Company. Earlier in the story, I told about how Thor entered the do-it-yourself market through acquisition of another company in that field. This same method of progress has been true in other markets, and it has been necessary because Thor's main factory is kept humming with industrial tool production. But take the construction and mining tool market, for example. Thor watched industrial America grow. The company looked at the coal mines and to the metal mines, where the ore for the metalworking industries was churned from deep in the earth with air drills. Thor was aware, too, that the automobile would bring better roads, that more factories would require faster and more efficient construction, that sites would be cleared for more new homes. Other tool companies were in these markets with heavier demolition tools that were not part of the Thor industrial line. One such company was a pioneer in both mining and construction. Its name was a byword, especially in the western metal mines. That company was Cochise Rock Drill Company. And to enter these new markets, Thor acquired Cochise in 1932. The purchase included a West Coast manufacturing plant in Los Angeles, where mining drills and paving breakers and other heavy demolition tools were engineered and produced. Other Thor acquisitions have been of a similar need. The Cincinnati Rubber Manufacturing Company joined the Thor empire in 1955 because it produces air holes used with Thor mining and contractors and industrial air tools. And Thor's sales organization promotes Cincinnati's line of conveyor belting for industrial and construction use, and Cincinnati's molded rubber industrial products. How closely allied do these new divisions become with Thor? Well, perhaps you remember a Notre Dame football player named Bill Shakespeare. He was an All-American halfback in 1935. After graduation from college, Bill joined Thor as a salesman in the export division. 20 years later, he became assistant to the president of the Cincinnati Rubber Manufacturing Division. Listen to Bill's story.
My experience is typical of the progress and opportunity that exist in Thor. I traveled Central and South America as a Thor export salesman for 20 years. I was successful, but I didn't realize how successful. I was given the opportunity to learn another phase of the business, to represent Thor within the Cincinnati Rubber Organization. The results have been wonderful because of my Thor experience and my personal acquaintanceship with those in the Thor sales branches. I've been able to assist in developing new business for Cincinnati through established Thor tool sales outlets. We work together because we have a common goal and common markets. Believe me, we're going places.
Another Thor acquisition in 1957 was Drying Systems Company of Chicago, manufacturers of industrial air conditioning and heat processing equipment. What's the connection between such a company and Thor? Actually, the association is another natural. Both companies serve mutual industrial customers. For example, automobiles are conveyed through Drying Systems paint drying ovens after they are assembled with Thor tools. And this applies down a long line of products: appliances, steel furniture, outboard motors, bicycles, you name it. What has been the result of Thor acquisitions? Well, the Los Angeles plant has been expanded beyond recognition. A new addition has been constructed at Cincinnati. Drying Systems has ample space at present for more production. And I told you before about the fantastic gains of the Speedway division, where a new factory, 3 times the size of the original building, has been built. And speaking of Speedway, there's another story there, too. The tiny electric motors that operate the coin-changing devices in millions of vending machines, the motors that run business machines, and the motors that operate the jukebox mechanism are produced by Thor's Speedway Electric Motor Division. And business in this part of the company is progressing so fast that when the new Speedway plant was built, it was necessary to retain the old factory to house the motor assembly and production. Oh yes, the Thor story amazes you at every turn. I have another subsidiary to tell you about, and in doing so, we would like to have you listen in on a series of messages telling us the facts about the export side of Thor Power Tool Company. We have talked about Chicago and Aurora and Los Angeles and Cincinnati. I haven't mentioned 25 other major cities in this country and Canada where Thor operates factory service branches. Now let's look at Thor in Africa, in Germany, in England, in Lima, Peru, in Mexico City, in Manila, in Antwerp, Belgium. And I don't mean just the Thor name in a telephone book, or a Thor salesman in his home, or a distributor who handles Thor. I am referring to companies, branches, to Thor physically, as a power tool industry overseas. Yes, and I am discussing factories, like the big new plant Thor's British manufacturing subsidiary, the Armstrong Whitworth and Company, Pneumatic Tools Limited, had to construct to handle increased business 2 years after it joined Thor. That's a good place to start, so let's call England and the Thor factory at Tynemouth.